Hey, Scott Lee of Elega Corporation here. I wanted to talk about frame rates because I think that a lot of gamers out there don't really understand how frame rates happen, right? So when we play games, we usually know that it's better to have high frame rates, right? But I think a lot of people actually don't understand why. And they demonstrate this on social media and stuff whenever they start talking about frame rates, and they clearly don't really know what they're talking about. They kind of make guesses as to why one game might have better frame rates than another game, and they're usually way off. And as a developer, I have some experience with knowing exactly how this works. When we're talking about frames, we're talking about essentially the same thing as animation. So when you animate something, what you're actually doing is you're actually taking a bunch of still images and you're putting them together into a series, and then those still images are played in a rapid fashion so that when they're played in order, to the human eye, it demonstrates this illusion of motion. With computer games or video games or console games or whatever, it's kind of the same way, sort of. But the difference is that the computer is drawing all of the graphics. It has to render everything onto the screen, and it has to calculate everything that's going on in the actual game. So if you have a high score, if you have a certain number of lives, if the enemies are aware of their surroundings and they're responding to player actions, all those types of things require some level of overhead from the computing hardware power, and those things will take away from the computer's ability to render a certain number of frames per second, right? So that's where these standards come from: 30 frames a second, 60 frames a second, and in fact 30 and 60 and even 24 frames a second, these typical frame rates, a lot of these actually originally come from video in a certain sense. Most video that we see in cinema has historically been 24 frames a second, but for some reason 60 frames a second kind of became this golden standard with video games. And in fact, it is an important number. It has a lot to do with the human eye, and it has a lot to do with how the human sensory system works, and that's a whole different thing that we could get into as well. But as far as frame rates go, here's what I want a lot of people to understand, is that it's not just the hardware power that makes a difference with frame rates, okay? So when console fanboys get into discussions, they always like to talk about whose console is more powerful and blah, 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 blah. Yes, the CPUs, or the central processing units of consoles and computers, they certainly matter. They do. And yes, when you have a faster processor, you will be able to do more with the same code as maybe another system could. That's true. But how that code is written is far, 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 far more important than how powerful the hardware processing power is. There are people, even at a professional level, who would disagree with me about this, right? But this is my philosophy. My philosophy is, and this can be demonstrated through a lot of examples from the 1990s and previously even. We used to accomplish things in computer games that were remarkable for the limited amount of computing power that we had. To give you an example, Total Annihilation, released in 1997, one of the seminal real-time strategy games of the day, that created this illusion when you were looking at the overhead map of 3D terrain. What you were looking at, though, was not actual 3D objects. You were looking at a 2D map that was painted, and it was meant to look 3D. And the 2D map actually had an overlay with some different colors that it was not visible to the human player, that would tell the 3D models, so the units on top of the 2D map, the individual units, those were 3D models. But it created the illusion of 3D more so than actually being 3D. If you're confused, don't worry about it. The point is that very little of Total Annihilation was actually 3D, but it was essentially sold as a 3D game. Yes, there were some 3D models in it, but that's really not the point. The point is that the whole game map was two-dimensional. But most people, I think a lot of people who played it at the time did not realize that they were looking at a two-dimensional image, okay? It's kind of like in movies, the way that they used to have like these giant painted backdrops. Yeah, a lot of people probably knew that it was a painted backdrop, or even today, like in movies, it's all CG and stuff like that. And yeah, a lot of the time we can tell when we look at it, okay, that's an effect. That's not an actual background, right? Because usually it's embellished in some way or whatever. But the point is that it gets the job done, and it's efficient and it's optimized. And in the case of movies, like, it allows you to tell the story. In the case of games, it allows you to accomplish a design goal. It allows you to accomplish a concept. In the case of Total Annihilation, it allowed you to accomplish this idea of, oh, well, when units are on hilltops, they deal more damage whenever they're shooting down at someone, or or when units are trying to move up a hill, they go slower, and so like that has this huge effect on gameplay and stuff like that. But the technical design of that game was all about how the software was designed. And if you look at the power of the hardware back in 1997 compared to now in 2017, at the time I'm making this video, it is night and day. 2017 has tremendously more powerful computers, and yet, in some ways, we have not really accomplished all that much more by using actual full 3D environments. That's not to say that using the 3D environments is not the right decision. I would say, yeah, it probably is. There's a lot more that you can do now than what you could do before. But again, what I'm saying is it's about the design of the software, more so than the hardware, to accomplish what it is you're trying to accomplish in gameplay. And so when people talk about games like Zelda Breath of the Wild, they think that the hardware has all of this stuff to do with why you see frame rate drops or whatever. It's not necessarily true. Because of the physics engine and how that may have been designed, there might be inherent problems in the calculations that are done as far as the physics go by the computer that may not be running very efficiently. And here's another example when it comes to hardware and software. Hardware these days has processing cores, and it used to be that all processors were single core. And so this whole thing of like dual core, quad core, you hear these phrases, that didn't even used to be a thing. So later, when we went from going single core to quad core, what we ended up with a lot more processing power, but most software developers are still programming their applications, even to this day, without consideration for using those multiple cores. So a lot of the time when you see software being built now, it's actually being built the way that it would have been built for really, really old computers. And I'm not kidding about this. And it's especially true that if you want to take advantage of multiple processing cores, it does take more effort. It takes more time. It takes more testing. Because what you have to do is, instead of running code across one straight line, you have to actually run it across parallel running, multiple lines where each one of these things is working on a different part of the same process. And then when they're all done, if they're all related to each other, you basically have to join them all up at the end and do something with that. And if the overhead for that is too large, then you're back to where you started. And so a lot of the time, unfortunately, there's just kind of this inherent problem with computing that a lot of the time you're just back to kind of square one if you mess that up. So as a result of this, there's a lot of applications that are built as though they were being built for single core systems, just because in terms of development time and writing the actual code itself, it does take a lot less time. And software developers are really expensive, and deadlines are always looming, right? And this is the way that businesses think about it. So the reason sometimes that we can end up with AAA games that have these really atrocious frame rate problems, a large part of the issue is actually probably the way that the code is written. And I just want people to really understand that, because I feel like that's always left out of the conversation. And I don't think that gamers have an understanding of that. I think that we're always talking about hardware power. And you know what? At one point, this was kind of true, because computing hardware in general, including on consoles, things like the Nintendo 64 and the SNES versus the Dreamcast and the PlayStation 2 and all of those previous eras in console gaming, computing power used to always be just so severely restricted. And increasingly, as time goes on, that is no longer the case. Instead, what the current modern issue more often is how do you engineer your game to efficiently use all of the power that you now have? A lot of developers are just not doing as good of a job with this as maybe they could be. But it's understandable because it is kind of difficult and tricky. Well, okay, at least it's understandable to me as a developer because I've gone through it. I know it's probably not understandable to the consumer. With graphical processing power now, tremendous things are possible, and it's all about how we optimize these things, okay? We can produce amazing experiences that have really, really dazzling visuals if we work hard enough at it, and if we have enough actual physical resources, because at the end of the day, what really produces a great product is a group of people. And that is still true. So guys, just be good to each other with the console wars. Increasingly, everything is just becoming more like computers anyway, and I hope that everyone understands this. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe if you liked the video. Make sure you check out Age of Nomads, which at the beginning of this video should have probably been the featured video. Otherwise, link in the description. Definitely check it out. Age of Nomads is the real-time strategy game that I'm developing at the moment. I do not have a release date for it yet, but it is about hunter-gatherers trying to survive in pre-Stone Age civilization, or actually lack thereof. Make sure you like the video. Make sure you comment. I want to know what you think. I want to know your thoughts on frame rates, and maybe you don't care about frame rates. You can let me know about that as well. I will talk to you again soon. Thanks for watching.